Okay, excuse me. So I want to finish up the 16th century, the 1500s today. I'm going to talk about painting some more. We're not going to keep talking about painting forever, though. I'm going to go do a couple of other topics, then we'll get back to the painting of the Baroque in a couple of lessons. But I do want to show you some more 16th century painting from the 1500s. I have, I guess, two goals today. One is that I want to show you the art of the 1500s. I think it's kind of obscured behind the art of the 1600s. I think that there's so much going on in the Baroque century or the 17th century that maybe this art from the 16th century is starting to get to be, this is 500 years ago. So this art is starting to get to be rather remote. It's extraordinary art. It's unusual, and the art that I'm going to show you. So that's one thing I wanted to do. And the other thing I want to do, perhaps more importantly, is to show you how two strains of art both are products of and need to be understood in the context of the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. So what we're looking at here is the consequences for painting, essentially, of the Reformation of the 16th century. That's kind of what we're about. So let's get started on that. I'm going to call this presentation Reformation and Reaction. I am going to look for some equivalences, I think, both in the good and the bad, both in the good consequences and the bad consequences of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. That's what we're looking at today, the Protestant Reformation and then the Church's Counter-Reformation in the 16th century. And I think that, I think that we want to see the good and the bad on both sides, and in particular, we want to appreciate the art of both sides. And another thing I wanted to mention, sort of meta, is that I've been talking so far about how sometimes things come together and you have a great confluence of influences and resources, like the flower blooming on the vine, you get a great flowering of culture, like you did in Florence. But another thing that causes great art is stress and times of difficulty. And we are going to have to linger once or twice during this presentation on the tremendous violence that characterized the Protestant Reformation, the Reformation period. It wasn't an easy thing. It wasn't until the Treaty of Westphalia in the middle of the 17th century, almost 1650, that you get the end of just terrible warfare, and that has a lot to do with the art. And you'll notice that death and doom and the underside of things are not ever very far from the surface of the art that we're going to look at today. There's a sense of macabre in all of the art, I think, that we're going to look at today. So first, let's look at some of the things leading up to the Reformation in the early 1500s. Let's look at some things that were already happening in the 1400s. And the thing I want to really talk about here is the printing press. I always make a mistake. I always think that the printing press is later, that it must be it's 1536 or 1636, not 1436. It seems very early because the printing press is such a monumental invention. It's such a tremendously influential development. We can say there's technology-driven effects. Nowadays, we're used to, say, with the social media platforms and so on, everybody understands that there are these big changes happening in the information technology, and that's affecting everything about our art and our politics and the way we talk to each other. But the same thing was happening 500 years ago in the beginning of the 16th century. In fact, historians have cataloged hundreds of thousands of pamphlets and flyers from the period of the late 1400s and early 1500s. And again, I can only speak for myself, but I find myself brought up somewhat short by that. I had not realized it was such a media-rich environment. Another thing about the printing press is some of these northern artists we're going to look at are engravers. And so when we marvel at the intricacy of their engravings, these things were also reproduced by press at the time in the early 1500s. So imagine people back in those days seeing these pieces. And then the last bullet point, another different point, which is that the printing press just opened up a huge floodgate in terms of demand for people to read the Bible for themselves, and in turn to have vernacular Bibles, that is, Bibles published, written not in Latin, but in local languages. And that also led to an increase in literacy and the design for literacy. And all of this was very subversive and very explosive for the theocratic regime that had prevailed coming into the 16th century. So the Protestant Reformation, and then we'll look at some art. In a sense, the Protestant Reformation is just common sense. And by the way, before we go through this slide, you may have your own identities as a Protestant person or as a Catholic person, but this is 500 years ago, so don't project a mental formation onto any of that. Let's just look at it. As I say, I'm looking for equivalence myself here today. I want to see the good and the bad, and I want to appreciate the art that comes out of this. So again, as I was saying, if Northern Europe is growing, the population's growing, the economy's growing, Europe is growing, time's going by. So it's really only natural that you're going to start to get some separation from the institution of the church in Rome, in a sense. I mean, it's in the details of the thing that it's fascinating. The broader movement is kind of an inevitability, I think, of the growth of Europe, really. And so Martin Luther, 1517, Henry VIII was having trouble with the Pope. He wanted to get a divorce, among other things, and so he split from the Pope in 1532, the English Reformation, and that's the Church of England, the Anglican Church, or here in the New World, we'll often see that as the Episcopalian Church. If you go to an Episcopalian service, you'll see that they have the robes and hats and other things, incense, and so on. And that's not coincidental. That's because that was instituted by Henry VIII to be a sort of substitute for Catholic service. And then the very austere John Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland. There, of course, in terms of the Protestant side of the Protestant Reformation, there was a school of real austerity that really frowned on the sort of voluptuous luxury of Rome, of the materialism of the South. Had a sort of austere, minimalist kind of vision. And that wasn't altogether great on paper or in practice for art. I mean, and so I think there is a sense in which the Protestant Reformation, just as, say, an Islamic revolution in our time, brought to some extent a restriction of popular culture and put some limits on what people could do. So that was sort of a dark side of that. We're going to look at some art that we wouldn't have gotten without it. A real irony is that Pope Leo, at the beginning of the 1500s here, wanted to build the biggest basilica in the world. He needed to raise money for St. Peter's. Remember, Michelangelo and the others are working in St. Peter's. And so he raises, among other things, this indulgences thing where you can sort of buy your dead relatives out of purgatory for money. It's very, it's very Trumpista. It's obviously a grift. And so, but he needed to make money to build St. Peter's, to build all the art in Rome. So also gives you some insight into how important public art was in this culture. Fourth bullet point there on that slide, just for a second about the spiritual end of it. After all, you see the Protestant Reformation. The good side of it is sort of getting back to individual Bible study, the doctrine of the inner light, individual communion with God. Very subversive for organized church, but not at all bad for the spiritual life of the rank and file people, where you get an idea that everybody's sort of a person of God, not only some people, and that sort of thing. But having said that, I explained the Protestant Reformation, those kinds of positive spiritual terms. I would also emphasize that the Counter-Reformation wasn't just burning people at the stake and stuff. I mean, a big part of the Counter-Reformation in the Catholic lands was also getting back to real spirituality, real prayer and meditation, that kind of thing. This is, after all, the time of the great Spanish Catholic mystics, Saint Teresa, Saint John of the Cross. So fantastic stuff happening also on the Catholic side in terms of Reformation, really. So the Counter-Reformation, not just against the Reformation, but the Counter-Reformation that is our Reformation, and counter to yours. The last bullet point, again, when I say 30% of the German-speaking population was killed, I mean, looking back on the slides, and the 30 Years' War at the beginning of the 17th century alone killed about 30% of the German-speaking population, and some number like that had already been killed off 100 years before in the Peasants' Revolt at the beginning, because if you pulled out the institution of the church, which was the institution that was collecting taxes, adjudicating disputes, doing all kinds of things, diplomacy, and that was just pulled away, then in large areas of Europe, you got a chaos. And there were literally times in some parts of Central Europe during the 16th century where authority had broken down. You had roving bands pillaging around, and the general population was gone. Everybody was wiped out. It was Mad Max kind of conditions, and it actually got that bad at times during that 100 years. So this is the context of the paintings that we're looking at, and this proximity of mortality is something that I think is very characteristic of 16th century art. So Albrecht Dürer, we find now, I think under the modern gaze, Dürer looks like this sort of Germanic craftsman, which he was. But Durer was very well known at the time. He was very well known to the Italian masters. He went down south and learned. And in fact, a big part of Durer is seeing that he's sort of taking a lot that he learned from Renaissance Italy back up to the north and trying to apply that to the northern situation. The people in these centuries, we'll see this also when we look at Velasquez collecting art for King Philip. They know each other. It's these top tier artists are aware of each other, and Durer was known to them from an early age, and we'll see some of the reasons why, especially when we get to his engravings. And he also was an intellectual person who published books on body proportions. He built projection grids like Brunelleschi to deal with extremities like feet and hands. And we'll see that his naturalism, his treatment of animals, some of his most beautiful works are his treatments of animals. And then above all, an engraver. What's an engraver doing? They're cutting on a metal surface with a very small kind of knife or a trowel kind of instrument. But first of all, Durer was very well known also for his paintings. Again, the Feast of the Rosary, what are we looking at? We're looking at a painting in a southern themed painting, but given the northern treatment, I would say notice in particular a couple of things: the treatment of the robust and unashamed treatment of color, no restraint in the treatment of color. That's something that's going to characterize all the art that we're going to look at here. The background, the landscape, naturalism. If you look at the landscape in those early Renaissance paintings by people like Brunelleschi or Fra Angelico, they're weird, they're strange, there's odd objects in them, or they're empty. And the idea that you were going to have a realistic background took a while, and then it was the naturalism, sort of getting back to nature of the North, that that led just into a frank interest in the landscape amongst these artists. Durer doing self-portraits, he had sort of theories there were religious theories, naturalism, and then Renaissance humanism. So his picture of the artist was that it was the talent of the artist, which was sort of an expression of God, a very grandiose sort of idea. If you're the artist, if you'll notice that later self-portrait on the right, he is very self-consciously depicting himself like unto Christ, if you will. Another thing to notice about that painting is the use of the darkness to emphasize and cast light. That's called chiaroscuro, light, dark. And when we get to the Baroque painting, people like Rembrandt and Caravaggio, you'll see that's an important technique. But Durer there then also showing his technical chops with that. And he does these beautiful, technically professional pictures of natural objects. And that's the artist. That's one of the points where you say, okay, well, the artist is liberated now. The artist wants to do a beautiful picture of a rabbit. That's okay. I don't know if he ever saw a rhinoceros. That again is an engraving. That's a believable engraving. Some of the stuff we'll look at is not so believable. I mean, you can sort of believe that someone made a plate carving that. This, a little bit harder. This is the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Um, Again, that sense of mortality, that macabre underlying element, an unreal element. Another thing happening here, uh, the folkloric pagan past of the North is kind of bubbling up through the Christian overlay. We see that in New World literature and art, for example, when we see indigenous elements bubbling up through the colonial overlay, like in Latin American novels. But we see that also in this Northern European art after the Reformation. And so that kind of very rough sort of folkloric Germanic tradition, you can now see it in these artists. Another etching. This is not a drawing. This is not a pencil on paper. This is taking an instrument and carving out lines on a metal surface to make a print that can be reproduced. St. George going off to kill the dragon and the demons trying to scare him off. And notice the castle and on the hillside in the background. And this is an engraving by Durer. Hieronymus Bosch, another just extraordinary artists. First of all, let me talk about the triptych. Triptych is something that comes up. Let me step out of that for a second. A triptych, so you've got sort of the altarpiece, and then you've got doors that close over the altarpiece. And the reason is to protect it, because you've got a very valuable painting and you want to be able to close that up so that it doesn't get hurt. Another reason for that is you can carry it. In fact, it was battlefield commanders in the Roman legions who had these triptychs that they would carry with them in order to do their prayers and devotions out in the field. Another reason then to linger over the triptych, I mean, Bosch has a number. He's not only, we're going to look at his most famous one, but most of the works that we have of Bosch are these triptychs. And so something was going on called iconoclasm in the 1500s. Nowadays, we think of iconoclasm as, the quality someone has is be sort of thinking outside of the box, like, well, that's an iconoclastic composer or something like that. But iconoclasm in the 1500s was this practice of sort of taking the enemy's religious iconography and dragging it out and breaking it, burning the paintings and smashing, throwing rocks through the stained glass windows. I mean, it's really terrible. And that was something that both sides did. They both went around destroying each other's objects. So that would be another reason why you would have a triptych that you could close to protect it. Something I didn't know before getting this video ready was that the triptych of Bosch that we're going to look at here is actually like 5 feet tall. It's enormous. And now I have to see a picture. I've never seen a picture of it in real life, but I think the Prado has it. I think maybe it was even Velasquez who bought it. I'll have to check that. There we go. So, all right, as I say, and we're going to look at the Garden of Earthly Delights. In fact, Hieronymus Bosch is a mysterious person, and we don't really know what he called any of his arts, but of his artworks, but we call this the Garden of the Earthly Delights. It is a triptych that has on the left-hand panel, it's going to have the Garden of Eden, and the big middle panel is life after the fall, like now, human life, and then the other panel, the right-hand panel to us, will be the hell after death, and then there'll be an outside. So that's what we're going to look at now. Okay. Here's another typical triptych. As I say, we have quite a few by Bosch. This is by Bosch, the Veneration of St. Julia, and you see the 2 doors there that can be closed in over the central painting. So that's just what triptych means. This is what the Garden of Earthly Delights looks like when it's closed. It's a primordial state of being after God has created the earth. You see God up in the left-hand corner there with his crown on, having created the earth. And then this is the triptych, all of it. And again, you've got the Garden of Eden on the left, this world, the fallen world in the middle, and then the sufferings and agonies of hell on the right. And what I'm going to do is, this isn't a super great reproduction here, but what I'm going to do is show you details moving from the left to the right now. And again, this is 500 years ago, pretty much. This artist is painting these. We don't know much about him, but we have his works, more than just this. Strange animals with good anatomic realism. And that strange structure in the Garden of Eden, it's like sort of, is it clam? I mean, crab? Is it crab? Is it vegetable? What is it? A sort of strange vision of nature. And then it looks like the griffin on the left is carrying off a bear in its talons. And then there's strawberries and berries and things. Here we are in our world. I think in the Middle Ages, they might have called, at the time, they might have called this the strawberry painting or something. It's got cherries and blueberries as the people are living their fallen life. All of this tradition, of course, is to cause humility and understand where you're going. And so the human being is treated rather roughly. But people will be people, floating around in their bubbles, and they got their raspberries and Lord knows, and owls. He's got a lot of owls. But, party's over, my friend, as we go into sufferings of hell. Another sort of extraordinary use of light and shadow there. Atmosphere altogether going south now, as we realize the consequences of our ways. Not at all good. And yes, those are Mozambiques flying out of that guy's ass. The next person we want to look at, but I mean, so yeah, Bosch. I mean, wow, he's just, there's more of that to come, but see how he's a force that's unleashed here. So then Bruegel knew Bosch and is influenced by him. In fact, at the end of Bruegel here, I want to show you a couple of his works that are influenced by Bosch in an interesting way. I think the thing to appreciate about Bruegel, and again, we're just touching the surface, there's a whole clan of these people. They're all kinds of these artists. But with him, we see a real secularism. I mean, so it's not just that, say, some sort of Protestant theocratic regime has replaced a sort of Roman theocratic regime. Rather, we see that the theocratic regime has been removed, and this artist is a secular artist, a popular artist who is depicting ordinary people, ordinary peasants, and has an interest in nature, a naturalistic artist, an artist with an underlay of morality, and his characters are people having a good time, ordinary people. He clearly loves his people. The individuals, when you look up close, tend to be slightly misshapen and perhaps somewhat fallen, but that's just, maybe that's a projection. This is the kind of thing. And so since he projects a kind of folkloric atmosphere, you think of it as kind of primitivistic, but this isn't a primitivistic art at all. Again, Bruegel, like Durer, is bringing some technical chops with him from his travels to the south. And these are very carefully wrought canvases with all kinds of technical things happening in terms of light and perspective. So we see this, now we have a very natural kind of treatment of perspective and his treatment of people. As I say, take a look at this detail from the peasant dance. Two things to notice, both that there's a dark side to Bruegel and the world that he's depicting. Think of the world of the fallen depicted by Bosch, and also look at the artistry involved in the detail that he gets onto the canvas. Okay, right on. And then he has these beautiful winter landscapes, and they are just proper landscapes. I like this returning from the hunt. Not a great reproduction, but he has many of these, and they're very nice people skating, of course, on the frozen river. Bruegel influenced by Bosch, and you've got this kind of moralistic, phantasmagoric, put the fear of God in you kind of kind of stuff. In fact, take a look at this. This is actually a engraving by Bruegel, the painter who painted this, did this engraving in 1558, sort of a la and in honor of Bosch, who he admired, Hieronymus Bosch. So I think that's pretty extraordinary. So we looked at the painting of the Protestant North, but there's also this painting in the Counter-Reformation, and I have to say I was a little, well, what happened to me? Let me step out of this. I don't know before we. Yeah. So on the one hand, I'm thinking, well, the Counter-Reformation, what is that? That's like the Inquisition, right? I mean, that's like burning people at the stake and Savonarola and everything. Not so great. But then I found out some interesting things, looking into things. And I found out that, as I was saying before, that there was also a very positive movement in the Counter-Reformation in terms of reforming spiritual practices inside the church. I also noticed that art critics, art historians really thought that the Counter-Reformation art was kind of more, had a bigger output and was maybe in some ways more significant than the Reformation art. And I could sort of see why that would be, coming to respect this. And then I looked at this mannerism, and then I realized that I had always liked El Greco, but I had never, what do I know? I mean, I'd always liked El Greco, but I'd never put El Greco together with mannerism. But El Greco is the ultimate mannerist painter. So not only was I wrong that the Counter-Reformation, which I associated with the Inquisition, was not something that was going to be to my liking. I mean, once you really get to know them, they're like, right. But actually, this artist that I had always admired is one of my favorite artists. El Greco is actually maybe the mannerist artist. So let's take a look at the art of the Counter-Reformation. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to say about the Counter-Reformation, look at that third bullet point there, because what we're looking at here is mannerism. Now, mannerism is in art history, in the narrative, the Counter-Reformation. But you can read Counter-Reformation two ways, right? You could say it's the Counter-Reformation, it's against the Reformation. I think that's the way a lot of people would read that. But you could also see as the Counter-Reformation, there's our Reformation to counter your Reformation, our Counter-Reformation, right? You could learn it like that also. But in any event, you have this style of painting mannerism, and it's reacting against these sort of guitarzan, technical stars, virtuosos of the high Renaissance, Leonardo and Michelangelo. And it's saying, well, that's kind of idolatrous, that's kind of vain. Let's get back to, let's put the artist, let's not have the grandiose artist. But then also reacting to this naturalism of the Protestant Reformation and saying, no, we're like ecstatic religious artists. We're not naturalistic artists. We're artists getting close to God. But then here's the thing. I mean, so the grammar of all that leads you to think, okay, so, pre-reflectively you think, well, so this mannerism then is a return to some other kind of art. It's going back, right? Because it's reactionary. It doesn't like the Renaissance. It doesn't like the Reformation. But that's not so. Actually, mannerism produces these paintings, which are very unlike just any paintings, really. I mean, it's a new thing. It's a new style, and a strange one, and I think in some ways a very sort of charismatic one. At least it's certainly very interesting. I wish I knew how to do that more gracefully. So Venus. This is Bronzino. Things to notice. First of all, the sort of movement away from the self-conscious movement away from naturalism, away from Platonic composition. In particular, mannerism is characterized by the treatments of the figures. I want to draw a little connection today, I think maybe from mannerism to a strain we see in the Spanish tradition. Then notice the body with the protruding buttocks on the left-hand side, and then the figure behind that, holding the figure sort of suffering the agonies of hell, and the juxtaposition there, and the general lack of naturalism. And so a typical mannerist paintings, sometimes you'll see in art historians will think of mannerism to the Renaissance as Rococo is to Baroque, that is a kind of decadent late phase. I don't think that's really fair. I mean, um, but in any event, what's the takeaway? Uh, Lack of composition and deliberately unnatural human figures. And then Tintoretto, who is a big influence on Caravaggio and these Baroque painters that we're going to look at next, use of, you've got these, first of all, phantasmagoric sort of figures flying around in the air, and a very dramatic use of light and color, again, prefiguring the work with light that the Renaissance, that the Baroque artists are going to have. So mannerism, kind of a deliberate kind of moving away, as I said, both from realism, both Platonic realism, transcendental Platonic realism, and natural Northern Germanic realism into a deliberate realism. And therefore the not actually entirely flattering name mannerism, as in mannered, as in affected, the affectedly ecstatic painter. So maybe named that by someone who's not sympathetic. But let's end up then with a look at El Greco, the Greek. And by the way, Greco meaning Greek, Grego, good old Castilian word, Grego for extranjero, from Greek, Greco to Gringo, Gringo, just some sort of phonetic derivative from Grego. Nobody in the United States military ever said green go. That's just a urban myth. So you heard it here. It's Grego from El Greco, from Greco, from Greek. In any event, El Greco was from Crete, which is significant because then he trained in that Byzantine sort of iconic tradition actually before he came out to the West. But he came out to the West for good, and he ended up settling in Toledo, where he was well known. El Greco was not completely obscure. El Greco did paint for the elite of Toledo. El Greco was known. But El Greco was a little bit strange for his time, I think ahead of his time. We'll see how some of his paintings very much anticipate, I think, French Impressionist paintings of the late 19th century. But we'll see with his figures. And then the other thing that I wanted to say, I mentioned before, I think when we look at the human figure in El Greco, there's also a line that sort of goes from El Greco through Velázquez, through Goya, through Picasso. I think there's a Spanish figure tradition that we can sort of trace back to El Greco, but you have to be the judge of that sort of thing for yourself. 1577, and a very typical composition for El Greco. There's always a kind of swirling movement, and you do always have these bright uses of pinks and reds and yellows. And again, a sense of the goal is to convey a sort of sense of ecstasy. The burial of the Count Orgaz. A lot of stuff is going on in this painting. Very much, again, a mannerist painting. He is not going for certain things that a Renaissance painter would be going for. The upper half of the painting, you have St. Peter with the keys to the heaven on the left. You have various saints on the right. The King of Spain has also been painted into the saints because the King of Spain had recently said he didn't really care for El Greco's paintings, and El Greco was kind of trying to make a little peace offering to him by painting him in there in that row of saints, watching what's going on. Again, you get this real swirling around. It's kind of almost, there's like a big circular current in his paintings. And then the bottom half of it, the myth of the Count Orgaz was that the Count Orgaz had been such a beneficent donor and supporter of the church that when he died, Saint Stephen, and I forget who the other saint is, I'm sorry, come down and carry him up to heaven. And so here that's being witnessed by all these gentlemen of Toledo. These are all actual real gentlemen of Toledo, Rembrandt does this in Holland as well. We'll have to look into whether they have to get paid to get painted in. I don't know, but we'll look at that. And that brings up another kind of strange thing about El Greco. El Greco is this kind of strange juxtaposition of Toledo and these themes of his. That is, El Greco painted himself into the portrait on the left, and then there's another face on the right, and these are all actual people from Toledo at the time who are identifiable. And then he does landscapes, but look at this landscape. The thing about the landscape is that just as much as with his treatment of religious themes, so with his landscapes, you see a kind of bending of reality or softening of reality. And we understand the mannerist to be doing this because the mannerist wants to get more in touch with their own ecstatic kind of feelings, a kind of religiosity. We think of the late 19th century French impressionist, someone like Monet or Pissarro. This looks like it could be by Pissarro. There we think that what they're looking at is kind of the subjective quality of the vision. But I mean, if El Greco is interested in the subjective quality of his spiritual experience, and the French Impressionists are interested in the subjective quality of their visual experience, there's not that much difference between it. So maybe it's not that much of a coincidence, but it certainly is striking that this painting from the late 16th century can be so much like a painting from the late 19th century. Okay, but certainly not true of all of his paintings. His paintings are often also highly eccentric, which is one of the things that I like about him. There's a map of Toledo painted on that piece of paper. I'm not sure, or maybe we might want to look into this a little more when we get to Vermeer and we look at this kind of thing. But just an extraordinary canvas. And again, you have to hand it to him, an extraordinarily wacky canvas. Oh, and by the way, in terms of the bowed landscape with the large figure in the foreground, Salvador Dali, the Spanish painter Dali, very most definitely influenced by El Greco in many of his paintings. Again, bold uses of color. When we get to Caravaggio, you'll recognize this kind of palette. The figures, so this ecstatic kind of figure. And as I say, I think that then from mannerism, we can actually see this figure going on in the Spanish tradition, maybe even perhaps literally. I mean, if you think of the painting of the engraving by Goya from the 19th century, from the Peninsular Wars, of the prisoners of war being shot by the firing squad, one of them is raising his arms up in that way. And then I believe if we look at Guernica, at Picasso's Guernica from the 1930s, we'll see another figure with their arms also raised up in a similar gesture, not coincidental, all that's quite self-conscious. So, I mean, literally, but I think there's a tradition, but I think also in the sort of some kind of spiritual treatment of the human figure. El Greco. Just finally ending up, I mean, it's just sort of delightfully, I have to say, this is kind of a delightfully bananas painting. This is Christ on the cross with landscape of Toledo. So you've got a mannerist Christ. Notice you've got a sort of elongated, distorted body. Everybody knew, of course, if you make the arms longer like that, it looks like the body's hanging on the cross more. But so you've got this very sort of strange and unnatural looking Christ. Okay. And what's that in the background? Oh yeah, it's Toledo. It's Christ on the cross with a landscape of Toledo. And that's just this typical juxtaposition of El Greco that we sort of see in the burial of the Count Orgaz. And we say, well, okay. But here, I mean, oh yeah, guess what? Toledo with bones and down in the ground. But, it's Christ on the cross with blood on the wood there, notice. Overlooking Toledo. So I think that it's that, kind of real eccentricity that we find in Mannerist art, that it's one of the things that I think is delightful about Mannerist art. So just to end up where I started, again, I want to show you some quite interesting and I think unusual traditions that we find in the 16th century and I think are obscured by the Baroque 17th century that sort of gets a lot of attention. And I wanted to tell you that story about sort of discovering the connection between El Greco and Mannerist art. And then getting back to the real beginning then, and particularly that it was the forces that were unleashed by the Protestant Reformation that are responsible both for this Northern Protestant art and the Counter-Reformation art that we looked at today. So all right, I think that's good. And I'll try and put together some good links of that for you. All righty then.